Hello again, everybody. Today, I'd like to tell you a little story. It's one of my favorite stories to tell in this class. And it has to do with a guy named Theseus, a young Greek man. He gets older eventually, but starts off when he's young. The Minotaur, the Amazon warriors, and the lost city of Atlantis. And if you didn't know before, all these things are actually connected. Truly connected. So, Theseus. This is the story at the start. Theseus is a young man who's been raised by a single mother who's told him his whole life that his father was deceased. Turns out, when he reaches adulthood, his mother pulls him aside and tells him, actually, your dad isn't dead. He's actually the king of Athens. This comes as a bit of a shock, as you can imagine, to the young man, especially when his mother tells him that his father instructed her that if he should turn out to be strong and handsome and charismatic, that, in that instance, she should tell him the truth. So I guess if he had turned out like me, he wouldn't have ever found out. So she tells him, and then there's another part of the story. The father said that she should tell her handsome, strong, and charismatic son to move aside a boulder near her house where this king of Athens had left his shoes and his sword, like you do, right? And Theseus is not the superhero type character. He's not the Incredible Hulk, Bruce Banner. He's not Iron Man. He's not even Spider-Man. He is a different kind of hero. So, looking at the boulder, he sees that there's a slope running downhill from it. So rather than trying to just Hercules his way through this, he digs a hole on the downslope side of the boulder, and then using the force of gravity, just pushes it gently over the tiniest lip of the hole that he has dug. The boulder moves aside, there are the shoes and sword, and he takes his prize. This very first challenge that Theseus meets in the course of his adventures is indicative of how he's going to solve these problems moving forward in time. This is very, very telling. So he takes the shoes and sword, and he heads out from his home towards Athens. It's quite a bit of a journey. You can see he encounters a number of challenges on the way getting there, including one opponent where he's going along this narrow path along the coastline, and it's just one lane footpath. And the opponent says, you cannot pass. It's sort of a Monty Python and Quest for the Holy Grail Black Knight type of situation here. And Theseus eventually stabs the guy with his father's sword. But as soon as the guy falls down dead and hits the ground, he springs back to life, because he's one of the demigod sons of Poseidon. So Theseus fights him again, stabs him, falls down, springs back up to life. Eventually, Theseus figures that he's fighting Wolverine, all right? And instead of allowing him to fall down to the ground, he holds him off of the ground as he stabs him to death until he's completely dead, and then he hangs his body in a tree so that it doesn't hit the ground. And incidentally, it's an olive tree, which should remind you of the association between olive trees and Athens and Athena, if you know your Greek mythology. Eventually, Theseus arrives in Athens. And initially, his father doesn't believe him. I mean, it's not uncommon for kings in the ancient world to have young men arrive claiming to be their sons, I suppose. But Theseus shows him, but Dad, I have your shoes. I guess this qualifies as an ancient paternity test. Possession of one's shoes apparently is proof enough. And he realized, yes, you are my son. Oh, but son, you have arrived here in the worst time possible. There's no way that I would want you to arrive at this time. Right now, Athens suffers. It suffers so because we are under the thrall, under the control of King Minos of Crete. The Minoan Empire controls us right now. And it is so bleak. It is so bleak because we have to send every year tribute to the Minoans. We have to send them tribute of 7 youths and 7 maidens, along with all sorts of wealth and wine and olive oil. Oh, son, would that you had not had to see your father subjugated like this. Well, Theseus, having grown up in poverty and raised by his wonderful, strong, single mother, didn't really see this as being that big of a problem because his father, the king, was still living in a palace. But anyway, so Theseus says, well, since you have accepted me as your son, I am now the prince, and now it is my duty to go forth and to free our people from this subjugation. And his father says, no, you mustn't go. I've just gotten to meet you. I want some bonding time. And Theseus says, no, father, that's all right. Not sure how attached he was to his dad, but father, that's all right. I will go, and I will volunteer to be one of the tribute to the evil Minoan Empire, and I will free us. I will free our people. The father finally relents and says, all right, well, if you must go, then when you return, on your return back from the island of Crete, don't forget, before you come home, to change the sails which leave our city of Athens in sails of black, sails of mourning, of the men and women that we'll never see again. Remember to change the sails from black to white. If you know anything about literary foreshadowing, this should, clue you in. And Theseus says, yes, father, I won't forget. So, King Minos of Crete. Let's see where we're talking about. This is the Aegean. You have the location of Athens and Crete. You see a number of the different Cycladic islands talked about in the other lecture about the Bronze Age of the Aegean. King Minos was an incredibly powerful king, according to this story of Greek legend. And he controlled an empire that spanned the seas because the Minoan navy was incredibly powerful. And they exacted tribute from a number of different places, including Athens in this story. And their navy and their military were powerful. And their ability to control the economics of this whole area were renowned. And he was a very proud king. And he had a beautiful court and a beautiful wife as queen and daughter. And one of the things that he was incredibly proud of was his herd of bulls, right? He had bulls and herds of cattle. And this was one of the things that spurred his renown throughout the region, in addition to his navy and his beautiful palace and his incredible wealth. So his Queen Pasiphae, she was a very proud queen as well, being the wife of an incredibly powerful and wealthy man who ruled over an empire that spanned the eastern Mediterranean. And according to this story, she at one point compared her beauty and power and wealth and court to that of Hera, queen of the gods. Now, if you know even a little bit about Greek mythology, you know that Hera, queen of the gods, really didn't like mortal women to compare themselves to her. So Hera, being Hera, decided that the punishment that Queen Pasiphae should receive for this arrogance and temerity to compare herself to the queen of the gods should be that Queen Pasiphae would fall deeply, madly in love with one of her husband's prize bulls. Now, there are different forms of love, but the form that Hera was thinking of is, yes, that form of passionate, physical, carnal love. This being a difficult engineering and physiological proposition, Queen Pasiphae approached the court engineer, Daedalus, who you see on the left of that picture there, whom she asked to create for her an animatronic or hollow cow that she could climb inside of so that she could be close with the bull. Yes, that's what I'm referring to. Now, the problems emerged from this is that it worked. It worked really well. Like, so well that the queen became pregnant with the bull's child. Now, this is a problem. This is a big problem. She concealed it for a while, but eventually the truth comes out, and the king finds out. Now, initially you think, what is he going to do? Well, obviously you can run through some possible scenarios on your own there, but the queen, no, she wants to keep the baby. So, but the king can't let people find out about this. I mean, it's bad enough to have one's spouse step out on them, but when it's with the livestock, that's particularly embarrassing, right? And you would lose a lot of respect as king, especially in the ancient world, if such a story were to come out. So the king has a solution. Since the queen will not let him kill the baby once it's born, he will imprison it in a place that nobody will ever see it, nobody will ever find out about it, and the secret will be safe. So the king decides that since Daedalus was at least partly responsible for this situation in the first place, he needs to construct a labyrinth. You may have heard of this term, right? It's a maze with, very incredible difficulty to find your way into and out of. And here on the left, you can see an illustration of an actual Minoan palace, archaeologically investigated. So you can see, as we'll talk about in the other lecture on the Bronze Age, some of the possible inspirations for this. So Daedalus builds this incredibly difficult to find your way into and out of maze. And the Minotaur, the child of the queen's infidelity, is imprisoned in the center of this labyrinth. And because the Minotaur, being the curse of the gods, also has a particular dietary requirement, unlike koalas that eat eucalyptus leaves, the Minotaur can only eat human flesh. So this becomes another problem for the king. You can't just kind of round up people close by, because then people start to get suspicious and start to ask questions. And why does your wife have a kid who eats people and you have imprisoned in this labyrinth? And then you got to answer all kinds of questions. So rather than use local people, the king decides to begin demanding from the tributary provinces outlying away from Crete that they have to send young men and women to Crete as part of the tribute. And they're the ones that are being fed alive to the ravenous Minotaur, half man, half bull, that lives in the center of the labyrinth. In addition to having to build this labyrinth, the king decides that so that nobody else can know how to get into and out of it, he will also imprison Daedalus, the engineer who built it, in the center of the labyrinth, along with his son Icarus. So Daedalus is imprisoned in here as well. Daedalus isn't really all that keen on being imprisoned. Being an engineer, he comes up with a plan. There are both birds that fly over the labyrinth as well as bees that build their hives. After he's been in prison there with his son for several years, he wants to get out. Sound familiar? Kind of like he's under quarantine. So he figures, all right, we'll take the wax from the beehives, and we'll take the feathers from the birds, and we'll make ourselves wings, and then we will fly out of the labyrinth and escape. This being Greek mythology, it works. Don't try this at home. So it works, and they fly out. He and his son are flying, and his son's really digging the whole flying thing. And Daedalus says, no, don't fly too close to the sun, because the wax on your wings will melt, and then the feathers will fall out, and you'll fall into the ocean and die. But Icarus doesn't listen to his dad. Again, sounding awfully familiar. So Icarus doesn't listen to his dad. He flies too high, too close to the sun. Remember, the Greeks didn't have weather balloons and space shuttles yet, so didn't know it gets colder as you get higher. But anyway, so Icarus flies too high, gets too close to the sun. The wax on the wings melts, the feathers fall out, he falls into the ocean and drowns. His dad, as his dad flies over him as he's drowning, says, I told you so, and flies off. That's not actually part of the original story, but a little bit of an addition doesn't hurt. So, Daedalus will actually reappear in other Greek stories, because if you have a degree in engineering, you can always find a job. Okay, so, back to our story of Theseus, who has now arrived at the court of King Minos as part of this tribute to the Minoans. And he's going to be sent into the labyrinth along with the other Greek boys and girls. And he petitions King Minos to end this travesty, and King Minos has a hard heart and says, no, this must continue, because he doesn't want his own embarrassing secret to come out. So he goes into the labyrinth. Wait, no, not that one. That's the one with, different labyrinth. So a labyrinth more like this, probably. This is a model of Minoan architecture as the inspiration for the labyrinth in later Greek mythology, like we'll talk about in the lecture on the Bronze Age. So Theseus is in this labyrinth, and being Theseus, not being, the biggest, strongest, toughest, or richest, he comes up with an idea. So, the Minotaur is pursuing him and all of the other Greek boys and girls. Theseus realizes, okay, there's no way, I don't have, much of a weapon, I just have this tiny little knife here, and as he's being sent into the labyrinth, he's approached by this young woman who's the princess of Knossos, princess of the palace of King Minos, his daughter, the daughter of King Minos. And she says to him, you're so beautiful, you're so handsome, and you're not from here. You'll take me away from here, right? You'll take me away. Okay, so here is a magical ball of string that will help you find your way into and out of the labyrinth, and here's a little knife. So escape from the labyrinth and take me away from here. I really hate living here with my mom and dad, or something along those lines. So Theseus goes in with this magical ball of string and this little knife, and he's encountering this problem. How am I going to escape from here? The Minotaur's chasing us. The Minotaur's eating these Greek boys and girls that came with me. And so he comes up with the idea. It's clever. He waits until all of the other Greek boys and girls have been eaten by the Minotaur. And apparently there's a tryptophan, like Thanksgiving turkey phenomenon here. After the Minotaur's eaten all of the other Greek boys and girls, he becomes sleepy and falls asleep and snores. And so Theseus is able to find where he is in the labyrinth by following the sound of the snores, and he kills the Minotaur while it's asleep. Hey, it may not be, the best kind of visual marker, but the Minotaur's dead and Theseus is alive, and Theseus is clever that way. Here you go. Here's one version of this, a much bigger knife than in the original version of the story. Here's another one. This one, see, the Minotaur's kind of sleepy right there. It's cleverness over brawn. That's the whole idea behind Theseus's story. So he escapes from the labyrinth. He runs down the hall and bursts out of the labyrinth, following this magical ball of string that Ariadne had given him. And she sees him running for the ship that his people have waiting for him at the port. There's nobody else with him, remember, because all the other young Greek men and women were eaten already. So he's running, and Ariadne says, "Oh, you escaped, you're alive. Take me with you, take me with you." And Theseus is like, yeah, sure. So he gets to the boat, they jump on, and they sail away, and the Minoans are chasing them, and eventually, somehow they manage to escape the Minoans. And, whoo, we made it, we're out of here. And, it's just so exhausting, and they realize they don't have enough water, so they stop on an island somewhere between Greece and Crete, and they go ashore, and they're collecting water and kind of resting, and Ariadne, the princess of Knossos, the princess of the Minoans, who gave Theseus the knife and the magical ball of string that enabled him to survive, she falls asleep. And he was never that into her to begin with, even though she saved his life. So while she's asleep, he ditches her on an uninhabited island and leaves. Because he wasn't feeling it. Right? That's Theseus for you. Don't worry. The god Apollo comes down and consoles Ariadne, if you know what I mean. So she does well for herself in the end. Apollo's a much better catch than Theseus anyway. So, Theseus is all full of his victory. He's sailing back home, having destroyed the Minotaur and freed the city of Athens from this horrible tribute that they had to pay. And as he's sailing back into port, he doesn't realize it, but his father is standing on the cliffs above the port, waiting for the ship to come back in. And father's waiting to see what color the sails will be. Remember, his father said, if you're successful, if you return alive, remember to change the sails from black to white so that I know that you're still alive. So Theseus is coming back into port. The sails weren't changed to white. So Aegeus, thinking that his city is still under the control of King Minos and still has to send this horrible tribute, and that his only son is dead, is overcome with despondency and throws himself off the cliff into the rocks below, and it floats away on the tide. And his name was King Aegeus. So the Aegean Sea is named after a suicidal king. Now the question you have to ask yourself is whether Theseus actually forgot to change the sails or whether it was intentional. Now, he was raised by a single mom, his dad kind of ditched him. I think it's entirely plausible that Theseus didn't change the sails on purpose, but you can judge that for that yourself. Couple of notes. In ancient Minoan art, as we'll talk about in the Bronze Age lecture, you see extensive references to bulls. In particular, murals showing, and artifacts and ceramics and even some cast iron pieces showing bull jumping. You can see on this mural here. Now, this would have been something that would have been very impressive to people in the ancient world. It's impressive to people today. And this may have been one of the inspirations for the idea of fighting the Minotaur. In northeastern Spain and edges of around the Pyrenees Mountains, there's this tradition of recortadores. I recommend you check it out on YouTube. Just type that in, you'll see a bunch of videos. It's amazing. It's like bullfighting, only the humans have no weapons and they don't kill the bull. And the idea is to not die from the bull in the most acrobatic way you can possibly imagine. It's really fun to watch. Check it out. Also, you have in the Minoan story, as we'll talk about in the Bronze Age lecture, this idea, is this Atlantis? Are the Minoans the inspiration for Atlantis? You can see on the left one of the representations of the city of Atlantis, and on the right, the island of Santorini today, Thera in the past, which was a volcano that erupted in a cataclysmic eruption with earthquakes and tsunamis and liquid hot magma. Very, very impressive. Spread ash over a huge portion of the eastern Mediterranean. Totally something that could have inspired the story of Atlantis. Here you can see a mural from the site of Akrotiri on the Greek island of Thera that's only 68 miles north of Crete, showing this city, this incredibly wealthy city with these Minoan ships and all of that. That sounds very reminiscent of the stories of Theseus and the Minotaur. Here you can see a map on the right of where Santorini is located, and you can see different kinds of volcanic eruptions. A Plinian eruption on the left. Well, the eruption of Thera was an ultra-Plinian eruption. That eruption ejected over 100 cubic kilometers of rock and caused earthquakes over 9.4 on the Richter scale in 1560 BC. This absolutely devastated the Minoan civilization. As we'll talk about in the Bronze Age lecture, this was a huge event in Eastern Mediterranean history. Totally something that would have been remembered and commemorated in stories. And you can see the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age was very, very connected. All the way from the Western Mediterranean, all the way to the Persian Gulf and up to the Black Sea, and certainly down into Egypt. This was a very interconnected world. Another part of this story is that of the Amazons. Here you can see some Greek representations on the top. On the bottom, you can see some recent DC and Marvel representations of the same idea. These incredibly strong, incredibly powerful warrior women, right? And this is a story, an idea, concept that has been in Western civilization since it was introduced by the Greek storytellers of this time period. Here you can see another version of this. Well, the idea here is that Theseus, after becoming king of Athens, following his father's suicide, one of the adventures that he went on with his men was up in the area of the Black Sea. This was an area that figures very prominently in a lot of Greek stories, including that of Jason and the Argonauts, because the Greek city-states, especially those of the Aegean, were very tightly tied into these trade networks into the Western Mediterranean, into the Black Sea, for things like grain and copper and tin, because the small islands that these Greek city-states were on didn't produce the kinds of resources necessary to hold these societies together. And so they were dependent upon the shipping and trade and interaction, controlling these routes of trade and grain and metals and different kinds of things. So they were very, very important, not just ideologically, but economically and politically. So one of the adventures that Theseus went on in this legend is up in the Black Sea. He and his men encountered a society that was horrible, so terrible, so awful. It was controlled by women. Women controlled the society. Women ruled, women fought, and men were forced to cook food and take care of children. It was more than the Greek men could bear. Just the idea of this was absolutely abhorrent. This was a horror film situation for the Greek men. So Theseus decided that what he had to do was liberate these men from this horrible oppression that they suffered. And so he went to war with this society. And of course, this being a Greek story, they won, and they defeated these horrible, horrible women. And interestingly enough, rather than honor the request of these Greek warrior women, or these Amazon warrior women, and during the Bronze Age, frequently defeated warriors were given the option of death or slavery. And since these Amazon warrior women did not want to be slaves, they requested to be put to death rather than be slaves. But Theseus, being steeped in his society of the Bronze Age Greece, decided he'd do one better. Not only would he not honor their request to die rather than be slaves, he wouldn't just make them slaves, he would give them as wives to his troops. so that they would become Greek wives and subjugated beneath the men. To him, this was the worst punishment he could give for their transgression of having dared to be women in charge of themselves and their own society and their own destiny. So the problem here is that this story has often been told as one of female empowerment. When we tell it today in the version of Wonder Woman, or we show examples of this, like the Dora Milaje of the Black Panther franchise, this is an empowering female story. The ancient Greeks were not telling it that way. The ancient Greeks were telling this as a demonstration of male power and authority and misogynistic control, and a way of creating an idea that needed to be opposed, a mirror image of why men should oppose female equality. And we have to remember that the reasons why these myths get created does not totally determine their modern significance today. But this was a story that was told by Greeks in the ancient world, not by us today in 2020. However, here's the really, really cool part. The Amazons were real. Bronze Age burials in the area of northeastern Turkey and other portions of the eastern Black Sea, society that archaeologists refer to as Sarmatians, actually contain bodies of women who are buried as warriors, who are not just buried in the form of warrior burials, but also have on their own physical bodies evidence for combat, evidence for healed wounds, evidence for the arthritis that comes from using a bow and driving a chariot and swinging a sword. These were real warrior women. They really existed. And not only that, these other burials in this region include women buried as head priestesses, women buried as leaders of their communities. So women were not just warriors, women were also able to be chieftains and priestesses and occupy all different ranks of authority in these Bronze Age societies of the eastern Black Sea. This is fascinating. This really suggests that the story of Theseus and the Amazons is not one that is completely drawn out of whole cloth from Greek misogyny and chauvinism, but is actually one that was inspired by the contact between Bronze Age Greek societies and these societies of the Bronze Age, thousands of years ago, where men and women, both, were occupying positions of authority and honor within their societies. So anybody who says that inequality between men and women is just the way it is, or that's how it's always been, does not know what they're talking about. There have been societies for thousands of years that have chosen to emphatically practice equality between men and women, in that they allow both men and women to occupy positions of authority, to be combatants, to fight for their societies, to live to their full potential. And these are real places that have existed, and not just in the 21st century, but for thousands of years. And if they can do it in the Bronze Age thousands of years ago, then it's certainly possible for us to do it today. This is the area of the Black Sea we've been talking about here. They're on the northeast part of Turkey and the Caucasus, where a number of these burials have been found. They've now been found even further north along the northeastern part of the Black Sea in what is today Russia and the Ukraine. Last thing I'll say is that sometimes the legends are real, or at least as real as they come. Labyrinthine palaces with all kinds of secrets inside of them. Amazon women warriors and rulers of societies in the ancient world. And cataclysmic eruptions of volcanoes and tsunamis that wipe out whole civilizations that were far more advanced than most of their neighbors and had a huge impact in creating the world around them, much like is described for Atlantis. So, the cartoon versions, maybe not, but all three of these things that we've talked about here did have a real kernel of truth at the origin